A cow escaped her farm and ran into the woods. What she found? There was unbelievable. The first person to notice the cow was missing was not the farmer, not his son, and not even the old sheepdog who usually barked at every unusual movement on the property. It was 9-year-old Ava Miller standing at the kitchen window with a glass of orange juice in both hands, watching the morning fog lift from the pastures behind her grandfather's farmhouse. She had been waiting for the cows to wander toward the feeding area the way they did every morning, slow and sleepy, their breath rising like smoke in the cold air. She knew them all by sight. Clover had the white patch shaped like a cloud on her forehead. Hazel had one black ear. Daisy was the smallest and always pushed her nose through the fence when Ava walked by with apples. But that morning, Ava frowned. "Grandpa," she called, not taking her eyes off the field. "Where's Rosie?" Her grandfather, Frank Miller, was at the stove turning eggs in an iron skillet. He was 64, broad-shouldered, gray-bearded, and built from a lifetime of lifting feed sacks, fixing fences, and worrying about weather. He glanced over his shoulder. "She's probably behind the hay shelter." "No," Ava said. "I can see Clover, Hazel, Daisy, June, and the twins. Rosie's not there." Frank set down the spatula. Rosie was not just any cow. She was a large red and white dairy cow with gentle brown eyes, a torn left ear from an accident as a calf, and a habit of resting her chin on Ava's shoulder when the girl stood too close to the fence. She was calm, dependable, and heavily pregnant. Frank had been watching her carefully for weeks, expecting her to give birth any day. She had a clean birthing stall prepared in the barn, fresh straw laid down, and the veterinarian's number taped to the wall beside the phone. Rosie should not have been wandering. Frank walked to the window. The pasture gate near the north fence stood open. For a second, he simply stared. Then he said one word Ava had only heard him use when tractors broke. "Ethan." Ava's father came in from the mudroom carrying his boots. Ethan Miller was 38, tired-eyed, and thinner than he had been before his wife died 2 years earlier. He had moved back to his father's farm with Ava because the city felt too loud after grief and because Frank needed help whether he admitted it or not. He was still learning farm life again, still relearning the rhythms he had once left behind. "What happened?" Ethan asked. "North gate's open," Frank said. "Rosie's gone." Ethan's face changed. Ava put down her juice. "She's having her baby soon." "I know, sweetheart," Frank said, already reaching for his coat. "That's why we need to find her." They were outside within minutes. The grass was wet from overnight rain, and the air carried the smell of mud, hay, and early spring thaw. Frank moved quickly despite the stiffness in his knees, following hoof prints near the open gate. The latch hung twisted, as if Rosie had pushed against it repeatedly until the old hardware gave way. "She broke out?" Ethan asked. Frank crouched by the tracks. "Looks like it." "But why?" Frank did not answer. The hoofprints led away from the pasture, past the equipment shed, across the lower field, and toward the woods beyond the creek. That made no sense. Cows liked familiar places. Rosie had lived on the Miller farm her whole life. She had never shown interest in the woods except to graze near the shade at the edge of the fence. Ava followed close behind, wearing yellow rain boots and a red coat, until Ethan noticed and turned sharply. "Ava, back to the house." "No, this isn't a game." "I know. Rosie may be scared or in labor. It could be dangerous." Ava's chin trembled, but she did not move. "She comes when I call her." Frank looked between father and daughter. "Let her come to the creek. No farther unless I say." Ethan sighed. "Dad. She's right. Rosie knows her voice." Ava swallowed hard and nodded. They followed the tracks across the field. At the creek, the mud told a stranger story. Rosie had crossed through the shallow water, but not alone. Frank saw marks in the bank, her hooves slipping, deep gouges where she had struggled up the far side. Beside them were smaller prints, not cow tracks, not deer. Ethan leaned closer. "What are those?" Frank's brow tightened. "Dog, maybe." Ava looked toward the woods. Was something chasing her? The thought made all three of them go quiet. Coyotes had been heard near the far ridge that winter. Stray dogs sometimes wandered from neighboring properties. A pregnant cow alone in the woods would be vulnerable if she panicked, slipped, or went into labor somewhere unsafe. Frank pulled out his phone and called Dr. Lena Brooks, the local veterinarian. "Rosie's missing," he said when she answered. "North gate broke. Tracks go into the woods. She's due any time." Lena's voice became immediately serious. "Any signs of labor before she left?" "She was restless last night. Up and down, but eating." "Find her fast, Frank. If she's calving in the woods, she could get into trouble." "We're looking now." "I'm on my way." Frank hung up and looked at Ethan. "You take the ATV around the old logging road. I'll follow the tracks on foot." "I'm not leaving you alone." "I'm not alone." He looked at Ava. Ethan shook his head. "Absolutely not." But before they could argue, a sound came from the woods. A low moo, distant, not loud, but unmistakable. Ava's eyes widened. "Rosie!" She ran before either man could stop her. "Ava!" Ethan shouted. Frank cursed and followed as fast as he could. The woods behind the Miller farm were thick with maple, pine, and fallen branches left from winter storms. The ground sloped upward from the creek, then dipped into an old hollow where the logging road used to pass decades earlier. Ava moved between trees, calling Rosie's name. "Rosie, Rosie, where are you?" The cow answered again, this time closer. Not distressed exactly, but strange, urgent. Ava slowed. Frank caught up and grabbed her shoulder gently. "No running. You hear me?" Ava nodded, breathing hard. Ethan arrived seconds later, pale with fear. "Do not do that again." "I heard her." "I know, but you do not run into woods alone." Ava looked down. "Sorry." Frank lifted a hand for silence. The woods were quiet except for dripping branches and distant birds. Then Rosie called again. They followed the sound down into the hollow. That was where they found her. Rosie stood near a cluster of fallen trees at the edge of a muddy clearing, her red and white sides heaving, steam rising from her body. She was trembling, her tail flicked anxiously. Mud streaked her legs and belly. She turned when she saw them, and Ava almost cried with relief. "Rosie!" The cow took one step toward her, then stopped. She looked back at the fallen trees. Frank noticed immediately Rosie was not alone. At first he thought she had already given birth. His eyes searched the ground for a calf, small and wet, hidden in the leaves. But there was no calf. Rosie's calf was still inside her. He could tell by the shape of her body, by the way she moved, by the signs of early labor beginning. So what was she guarding? Rosie lowered her head toward the tangle of fallen branches and gave a soft rumbling moo. From beneath the trees came a tiny cry. Not a calf, a human cry. Ethan froze. Ava's hand flew to her mouth. Frank stepped forward slowly. "Hello?" The cry came again, weak, muffled, terrified. Ethan pushed past the branches, his face going white. "There's someone under there." Frank grabbed his arm. "Careful, the logs could shift." But Ethan was already dropping to his knees. Beneath the collapsed branches, in a pocket of leaves and mud, was a little boy. He looked about 4 years old. His face was dirty, his lips blue with cold, and one sleeve of his jacket was torn. He was wedged between two fallen limbs near a shallow ditch, one leg trapped beneath a branch. He was conscious, but barely. His small hand clutched a strip of red fabric. Ethan's voice broke. "Oh my God!" Ava began crying. "Who is he?" Frank looked around the clearing, heart pounding. "I don't know." Rosie shifted anxiously, then moved closer to the boy, placing her huge body between him and the deeper woods. That was when they heard growling, low, from the trees beyond the clearing. Ethan looked up. 2 thin, stray dogs stood at the edge of the brush. Not coyotes, dogs. Both muddy, ribs showing, eyes fixed on the trapped child. One was brown and scarred across the muzzle, the other black with a torn collar dangling from its neck. They had the desperate look of animals gone feral through hunger and fear. Rosie swung her head toward them and stamped one hoof. The dogs backed up. Frank suddenly understood. Rosie had not escaped because she was frightened. She had escaped because she had found the boy, or heard him, and she had been standing guard. The red fabric in the boy's hand fluttered weakly. Ava recognized it first. "That's from the kite," she whispered. Ethan turned. "What?" "Mrs. Carter's grandson had a red kite yesterday. I saw it when we drove past their house." Frank's stomach dropped. The Carters lived on the other side of the woods, nearly a mile away. Their daughter had been visiting with her little boy Lucas. Frank had heard about it at the feed store. If the child had wandered off chasing a kite the previous evening, he could have been out all night, in cold rain, with stray dogs nearby. Ethan pulled out his phone, but there was no signal in the hollow. "Dad," he said. "I know." Frank looked at the boy, then at the unstable branches, then at Rosie, who was breathing harder now, her body tightening with another sign of labor. Everything was happening at once. Rosie needed the vet. The child needed emergency help. The dogs had not gone far, and if the fallen branches shifted wrong, the boy could be crushed or injured further. Frank handed Ava his phone. "Climb back to the ridge until you get signal, call 911, then call Dr. Brooks again, tell her exactly where we are." Ethan immediately shook his head. "She's not going alone." "I can do it," Ava said, wiping tears from her face. "No," Ethan said. Frank looked him in the eye. "We need help now. You and I have to stay with the boy and Rosie. Ava knows the way back to the ridge. She is not going beyond the creek. She calls and comes straight back." Ethan hated it, but he knew Frank was right. Ava took the phone with shaking hands. "Stay on the path," Ethan said. "No running." She nodded. Then she ran anyway, but carefully enough that no one stopped her. Frank and Ethan turned back to the boy. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said softly, lying flat in the mud to get closer. "Can you hear me?" The boy's eyes fluttered. "Mommy," he whispered. "What's your name?" "Lucas." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Ava had been right. "Lucas, we're going to help you. Stay still, okay?" "Cow," the boy whispered. Frank looked at Rosie. "She kept you safe, didn't she?" Ethan said. Lucas's tiny fingers tightened around the red fabric. "Big cow," he whispered. Rosie mooed softly as if answering. The dogs growled again from the trees. Frank stood and picked up a fallen branch, not to attack, but to make himself larger. "Get out of here!" Rosie stepped forward too, head low, a deep sound rumbling from her chest. The brown dog lunged one step, then stopped when Rosie stomped. Frank had seen cows defend calves before. A determined cow could injure a dog badly. Rosie was pregnant, tired, and in pain, but in that moment she looked as immovable as a wall. The dogs retreated into the brush, for now. Ava reached the ridge and got one bar of signal. Her voice shook so badly the dispatcher had to ask her to repeat herself twice, but she got the words out. Missing child, trapped under fallen trees, pregnant cow in labor, stray dogs nearby, woods behind Miller Farm, old logging hollow. Then she called Dr. Brooks. The vet answered from her truck. "Ava, where's your grandfather?" With Rosie, she found a little boy. Lena went silent for half a second. "A little boy?" "He's trapped. Rosie's guarding him, and I think she's having her baby." "I'm 5 minutes from your farm. Tell your grandfather I'm bringing the emergency kit. Stay safe and do not approach Rosie if she's in active labor." Ava swallowed. "She won't hurt me." "Ava," Lena said firmly, "even gentle animals can hurt people when they're scared or in pain. Promise me." "I promise." By the time Ava returned to the hollow, Frank and Ethan had cleared some smaller branches from around Lucas without moving the heavy limb pinning his leg. Rosie stood near them, restless now, shifting her weight, tail raised slightly. Her contractions had begun. Frank saw Ava's face and knew. "Help coming?" She nodded. 911, Dr. Brooks, everybody. "Good girl." Ethan looked at her. "You did great." Ava wanted to run to him, but she stayed back because Rosie turned her head and gave a low moo. Not angry, not threatening, but warning. Rosie was close. The next 15 minutes stretched unbearably. Lucas drifted in and out of awareness. Ethan kept talking to him, asking about his mother, his favorite toys, anything to keep him awake. Frank kept watch for the dogs. Ava stood near a tree, crying silently, afraid for the boy, afraid for Rosie, afraid for the calf that was trying to enter the world in a muddy clearing surrounded by danger. Sirens finally sounded in the distance, then voices. Firefighters arrived first from the farm side, carrying rescue tools, blankets, and a stretcher. Captain Jonah Reed led them, a compact man with calm eyes and a voice that cut through panic. "Who's trapped?" Ethan pointed. "Boy under the deadfall, leg pinned." "Any spinal concerns?" "He's been mostly still. We haven't moved him." "Good." Dr. Lena Brooks arrived moments later, breathless from hurrying through the woods with her field bag. She took one look at Rosie and said, "She's in labor." Frank nodded grimly. "I know." Lena looked at Lucas under the branches, then at Rosie, who stood protectively nearby. "Of all the places," she whispered. Captain Reed assessed the fallen trees. "We need room to work. Can the cow be moved?" Lena shook her head. "Not safely. She's in active labor, stressed and bonded to whatever she thinks she's protecting here. If we try to force her away, she could panic." "She's guarding him," Ava said. The captain looked at her. Ava pointed toward Lucas. "She found him. The dogs were near him. She wouldn't leave." Captain Reed looked back at Rosie with new respect. "All right," he said. "Then we work around her." It took careful coordination. Firefighters used cribbing blocks and hydraulic tools to stabilize the fallen branches before lifting the limb pinning Lucas's leg. Lena stood near Rosie, speaking softly, monitoring her labor while also watching her body language. Frank held Rosie's halter after Lena managed to slip it on, not pulling, just giving the cow a familiar anchor. Ava stood where Rosie could see her, but far enough to be safe. "Easy, girl," Frank murmured. "You did good. Just a little longer." Rosie lowed deeply. Lucas cried when the pressure lifted from his leg, then whimpered, "Cow." Ethan leaned close. "She's right here. She's still here." The firefighters freed him at last. His leg was bruised and possibly fractured, but intact. He was cold, dehydrated, and terrified, but alive. As they wrapped him in warm blankets, Rosie stretched her neck toward him and sniffed his hair. Lucas lifted one tiny hand from the blanket and touched her nose. Everyone stopped. Rosie exhaled softly. Then another contraction hit, and she turned away. Lena's focus snapped fully to the cow. "Okay, calf is coming." The ambulance crew carried Lucas toward the ridge where the stretcher could be moved more easily, but he cried when Rosie disappeared from view. "The cow," he sobbed. "The cow saved me." Ethan walked beside him. "Yes, buddy, she did." As Lucas was taken to the ambulance, another vehicle arrived at the farm, a frantic woman's car, door left open, engine still running. Sarah Carter stumbled out, screaming her son's name. She had reported Lucas missing before dawn. Search teams had been looking from the Carter side of the woods, but the storm had washed away tracks. No one imagined he had crossed so far into the Miller Hollow. No one knew the old deadfall had hidden him. Sarah reached the ambulance just as Lucas was being loaded. "Mommy!" he cried. She climbed in beside him, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. "Where was he?" she asked Ethan. "In the woods," Ethan said. "Our cow found him." Sarah stared at him. "Our cow found him and stayed with him until we got there." Inside the woods, Rosie gave one final deep, straining low. The calf was born in the muddy clearing beneath the trees. Ava watched from a safe distance, both hands pressed over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The calf slid into the straw-colored leaves and wet grass, small and red like her mother, covered in birth fluids and trembling with life. For a few seconds she lay still, and Ava's heart stopped. Then the calf moved. Lena laughed with relief. Healthy heifer. Frank closed his eyes. Rosie immediately turned and began licking the calf with firm, devoted strokes, cleaning her, warming her, urging her into the world. She was exhausted. Mud streaked her body. Her sides trembled. She had spent the night guarding a human child from stray dogs while carrying her own baby, then waited until help arrived before giving birth. Frank's voice broke. "Rosie, you miracle girl," Ava whispered. "Can we name the baby Hope?" Frank looked at Ethan, who had returned from the ambulance with red eyes. Ethan nodded. "I think we have to." Getting Rosie and Hope back to the farm was slow and careful. Lena examined them both and decided they were stable enough to move after Rosie had rested and the calf had nursed. Frank brought a livestock trailer as close as the terrain allowed. Rosie, after all she had done, walked willingly behind Ava's voice and Frank's hand on the lead rope. The calf wobbled beside her, awkward and determined. At the farmyard, neighbors had gathered. Word had spread fast. Missing child found alive, rescued by a cow, calf born in the woods. Sarah Carter came later that afternoon after doctors confirmed Lucas would recover. He had a hairline fracture, hypothermia, and bruises, but no life-threatening injuries. When Sarah stepped into the Miller barn, she looked as if she had aged 10 years in one night. Lucas was in the hospital with his grandmother, but Sarah needed to see Rosie. The cow stood in the clean birthing stall with little Hope curled beside her in fresh straw. Sarah stopped at the gate and began crying. Frank took off his hat. "She's the reason my son is alive," Sarah whispered. No one argued. Rosie lifted her head and looked at the woman. Sarah pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "Thank you," she said, though everyone knew Rosie could not understand the words the way a person would. But Rosie seemed to understand the feeling. She blinked slowly and lowered her head back toward her calf. In the days that followed, the story swept through the county. A pregnant cow had broken through a gate, crossed a creek, found a lost child trapped in the woods, kept stray dogs away, and stayed until humans arrived. Some people called it instinct, some called it a miracle. Frank refused to argue with either version. "She heard a cry," he said whenever someone asked, "and she went." That was enough for him. News crews came, but Frank allowed only one short interview because he did not want crowds upsetting Rosie and Hope. Ava stood beside him in the barn, one hand on Rosie's neck, while the reporter asked how a cow could possibly know a child needed help. Ava answered before Frank could. "Because animals notice things we don't," she said. "And Rosie has a good heart." The reporter smiled, but Frank did not. He knew the girl was right. The search for the stray dogs led to another discovery. Animal control and volunteers found a small pack living near an abandoned hunting cabin deeper in the woods. They were starving, scared, and surviving badly. 2 were captured safely. The rest were eventually trapped and taken to a rescue facility. None had been born wild. All had likely been abandoned. That part of the story changed the town too. People began talking not only about Rosie's heroism, but about what abandonment did to animals. The county increased patrols around dumping sites. A local rescue organized low-cost spay and neuter clinics. Farmers repaired old fencing and checked wooded edges for hazards. The Millers rebuilt the north gate with a stronger latch, though Frank joked nothing short of a bank vault could stop Rosie if she decided someone needed saving. Lucas visited the farm 3 weeks later. He arrived with a bright blue cast on his leg, holding his mother's hand. He was shy at first, hiding behind Sarah when Frank opened the barn door. But when he saw Rosie, his face changed. "Big cow," he whispered. Rosie stood calmly in her stall, chewing hay, little Hope beside her. Ava opened the gate just enough for Lucas to reach through safely. "She remembers you," Ava said. Lucas touched Rosie's nose with 2 fingers. Rosie breathed softly against his hand. Sarah cried again, but quietly this time. Lucas looked down at the calf. Baby cow? Ava smiled. Her name is Hope. Lucas considered this seriously. Then he said, Rosie found me before Hope came. Frank leaned against the stall wall, his throat tight. Yes, he said. She did. From then on, Lucas visited often. At first, he came because his mother thought it might help him heal from the fear of the woods. Then he came because he loved Rosie and Hope. He and Ava became friends, united by the strange bond of having both been part of Rosie's unbelievable night. Ava taught him how to hold apple slices flat on his palm. Lucas told Hope secrets through the stall gate. Hope grew quickly, bright-eyed and curious, with her mother's red coat and one white patch shaped almost like a star on her chest. Ethan changed too. Since his wife's death, he had moved through life carefully, as if joy were something fragile that might punish him if he trusted it. But watching Rosie save Lucas, watching Ava stand brave in the woods, watching the whole town gather around one impossible act of animal courage, something shifted in him. The farm no longer felt like a place he had retreated to because he was broken. It felt like a place still capable of giving life back. One evening, as he and Frank repaired the old creek fence, Ethan said, I used to think coming back here meant I failed. Frank hammered a nail into the post and said nothing. Ethan continued, but Ava's happier here. I think I am too. Frank looked at him. Your mother always said the farm gives people work until they're ready to feel again. Ethan smiled sadly. Sounds like her. It annoyed me every time. I bet. They worked in silence for a while. Then Frank added, Rosie gave us work that day. Ethan looked toward the barn where Ava's laughter carried across the yard as Hope tried to chew her sleeve. Yeah, he said, she did. A year later, on the anniversary of the rescue, the Millers hosted a small gathering at the farm, not a festival. Frank would never allow that. Just neighbors, firefighters, Dr. Brooks, the Carter family, and the animal rescue volunteers who had helped with the stray dogs. Someone brought pie, someone brought cider. Lucas, now fully recovered, ran carefully across the grass with Ava while Hope trotted along the fence line beside them, much bigger but still playful. Rosie stood under the shade tree, calm as ever, accepting admiration like a queen who had better things to do. Captain Reed presented Frank with a framed photo taken the day of the rescue. Rosie in the barn with Hope beside her, Ava leaning against her shoulder, mud still visible on everyone's boots. Frank pretended the dust in the air was bothering his eyes. Sarah Carter stood beside Rosie for a long time before speaking to the group. My son remembers pieces of that night, she said. He remembers being cold, he remembers the branches, he remembers dogs growling, and he remembers Rosie standing near him. He says he wasn't alone because the big cow stayed. Her voice broke. I don't know how to thank an animal for that, but I can thank this family, and I can thank this community for what happened after. You didn't just save Lucas, you changed how we look after each other. Ava stood beside Rosie, one hand buried in the cow's warm coat. Lucas leaned against his mother. Hope nudged Frank's pocket for treats. Everyone laughed softly. Years passed and Rosie's story became part of Willow Creek's local legend. Children learned it at school during Farm Safety Week. People told new families about the cow who ran into the woods and found a missing boy. The old hollow was cleared of dangerous deadfall near the path, though Frank left much of the woods wild. A small sign went up near the creek trail. Stay on the path. Listen for those who can't speak. Ava grew older and eventually decided she wanted to become a veterinarian like Dr. Brooks. Lucas grew up loving animals, especially cows, and every birthday he asked to visit Rosie. Hope became one of the gentlest cows on the farm, though Frank claimed she had inherited her mother's stubborn streak and could open latches with suspicious intelligence. Rosie lived many more good years. She never escaped again. But Frank sometimes said that was only because no one else in the woods needed her badly enough. On quiet mornings when fog lifted from the pasture and Ava, now a teenager, helped with feeding before school, Rosie would raise her head at the sound of distant birds or deer moving near the woods. She always listened carefully. Always. Ava noticed. She thought about that day often, the open gate, the hoofprints, the cry beneath the trees, Rosie standing between a trapped child and danger while her own calf waited to be born. It had changed the way Ava understood animals forever, not as simple creatures moved only by hunger and habit, but as beings aware of the world in ways humans often overlooked. One spring morning, years later, Ava stood beside Rosie in the pasture while Hope grazed nearby. Lucas, visiting with Sarah, leaned against the fence and said, "Do you think she knew I was a kid?" Ava looked at Rosie. The cow chewed slowly, peaceful in the sun. "I don't know," Ava said, "but I think she knew you were small and scared." Lucas nodded. "That was enough," he said. Ava smiled. "Yes," she said, "that was enough." And maybe that was the heart of the whole unbelievable story. Rosie did not need to understand names, families, roads, search parties, or human fear. She heard a cry in the woods. She found a child who needed protection. She stood her ground. She waited until help came. Then, only then, she brought her own baby into the world. So before we go, remember this. Courage does not always roar, fly, or run on fast legs. Sometimes courage moves slowly through foggy pasture, pushes open a broken gate, crosses a cold creek, and stands guard in the woods with gentle brown eyes and a mother's heart. A cow escaped her farm one morning, and what she found there was unbelievable. A lost child, a hidden danger, and a chance to prove that compassion can live in even the quietest creatures. Rosie was only a cow, some people said. But to one little boy, she was the reason he survived the night. And to everyone who heard her story, she became a reminder that love, instinct, and bravery often appear in the most unexpected form.